Many of us love to travel. While traveling, we often see palaces and castles, temples and monasteries, ancient and medieval fortresses and ruins of cities. We visit museums. While looking at museum exhibits, we recall the knowledge, often in fragments, learned in history classes. Sometimes we flash back to something that we saw on TV shows or movies, or read in books and newspapers. Here is the sword of Alexander the Great. When did this fearsome ruler live? It seems that he lived in the 4th century BC. He was a strong man. He conquered Greece, Persia, almost all of India. And here are the Etruscans. What did our history teacher say about them? They were some mysterious people, apparently appearing out of nowhere in Italy. And it was also said that no one could decipher their inscriptions. The ancient amphorae were made of very hard diorite stone. Yes, they were skilled craftsmen. And all of this was several thousand years ago. Even now, it's probably difficult to make such things. And back then, it seems, was the Bronze Age. Remarkable. Despite the fact that not everyone remembers even the basic historical events, in our hearts we believe that everything in history is sufficiently determined. And at least the historians themselves know everything and are confident in their knowledge. Museum visitors are unaware that hundreds or even thousands of exhibits are stored in storage rooms that are not put on public display because they contradict established views of history. Can we confidently say that we know history? Each of us is literally packed with historical information. We got this information from textbooks, radio and television shows, from books and newspaper articles. Critically sorting out this information is often almost impossible, since for several centuries it has undergone mutual agreement, forming a monolith of historical knowledge, or rather pseudo-knowledge, and also due to the huge volume of the material itself. It is worth noting that history is studied in our days by epochs and countries. Probably this was done unintentionally, but such an approach does not allow modern man to see the history of mankind as a whole. Instead, he sees a patchwork quilt with holes of ignorance gaping in it. Therefore, we have to resort to the opinion of authorities. But do we trust the right authorities? And are they right about everything? And is there something behind them that prevents us from critically examining our past? It turns out that there are ways to verify the truthfulness of certain historical science claims. This turned out to be within the capabilities not of historians, but of specialists from another field of knowledge, namely mathematicians. In the previous episode of our series, History, Science or Fiction, we talked about the research of Russian mathematicians in the field of historical chronology. In this film, we will recall the key results of this study, because they fundamentally change our understanding of the past. As a result of many years of work, a group of Russian mathematicians from Moscow State University has created several new mathematical methods for studying historical texts. The effectiveness of these methods was tested on a sufficiently large and reliable material from the Middle Ages and the New History, that is, the 17th to 20th centuries. Then, these methods were applied to chronicles that historians attribute to the era before the 16th century AD. When studying these documents, repetitions were discovered in world history as well as three chronological shifts: approximately 330 years, 1050 years, and 1800 years. As a result of these shifts in history, duplicates of a number of historical personalities and ruling dynasties, and even entire historical eras appeared.
We found that different historical chronicles actually describe the same events, but they were erroneously attributed to different historical eras. Through the use of our research, we were able to identify these historical twins. As a result, we have built a new timeline, chronological scale, which is very different from the Scaliger-Petavius chronology generally accepted today.
This new timeline, or chronological map, as scholars call it, has taken the traditional historians by surprise. It turned out that the history was not at all what it is commonly believed. Historians refused to believe it, and the authors of the new chronology themselves had to undertake the construction of a new, real history. That is, to carry out the reconstruction of history based on the correct dates of the new chronological map.
The version of history before the 17th century that exists today is monstrously distorted. These mistakes were made by the chronologists of the 16th and 18th centuries. At the same time, along with unintentional errors, major distortions were made that border on falsification. As a result, we managed to restore the true history before the 17th century. The completion of this activity of creating a fake version of history sometimes lasted even until the 19th century. In some cases, even in the 20th century, major distortions of ancient history have been made.
In this film, we will try to present the reconstruction of the main events of world history over the centuries. We will talk about this very briefly, but in sufficient detail so that the history of the world can be taken at a glance. In the next films of our documentary series, we will take a closer look at the most interesting and important moments in world history. And now let's see together what history looks like if we follow the correct chronology proposed by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky. Let's go through the centuries of history. No information has come down to us in written sources about events earlier than the 11th century AD. Probably, there was no written language at that time yet. It appeared only in the 10th–11th centuries of the Common Era. The epoch before the 11th century must be thought of as prehistoric era at the dawn of civilization. Probably, at that time people did not yet know how to build any significant structures, and even more so buildings, so they lived in caves or dugouts. Only primitive and crude tools of these people have survived to this day. Pottery fragments, bones, stone tools, knives, stone arrowheads and spears. Primitive jewelry made of mammoth bones or teeth of predators. Today, all this is exhibited in museums, in halls dedicated to primitive man, who allegedly lived many centuries and even millennia BC. But despite the lack of written information, in modern history textbooks there are many details about the life of people in the era before the 10th century AD. Textbooks tell about the legendary Sumerians, about the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and America, about the luxurious ancient culture of Egypt from the time of the pharaohs. The Trojan Kingdom and the famous Trojan War allegedly of the 13th century BC are described in great detail. Enlightened ancient China, great ancient Rome, mysterious ancient India, ancient Assyria, Syria and Persia, as well as the most ancient biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judea.
And as we are told today, all this existed in the era before the 10th century AD.
It is not true. All this really existed, but only after the 10th century AD. That is, in the last millennium of our history. The real written history of the world turned out to be much shorter. The most ancient kingdom was the First Rome or Ancient Rome. The capital of this ancient African kingdom was located near the mouth of the Nile. Subsequently, this city became known as Alexandria. Today we have practically no information about this kingdom. Probably, it was here that writing originated, and initially as a hieroglyphic writing. That is, people at that time wrote down with pictures.
We will conditionally call Alexandria the First Rome.
There were no Cyclopean architectural structures known to us in Egypt at that time yet. There were no pyramids and sphinxes, temples and obelisks. All of them would be erected much later, in the era of the 14th–16th centuries AD. In the 10th–11th centuries, the capital of the kingdom was moved to the Bosporus, where the city of Oros was founded, located on the outskirts of modern Istanbul.
We will conditionally call it the Second Rome.
It was also known as the Jerusalem of the Gospels, ancient Troy, medieval Constantinople. Same as the medieval Tsargrad. Same as the modern Turkish city of Istanbul. It should be noted the excellent strategic position of this city and its powerful military fortifications, significant remnants of which have survived to this day. The power of the Second Rome extended to many regions of the Occident and the Orient. Here were located the provinces of Byzantium called Themes. Such provinces were Egypt, ancient Russia, the territory of Western Europe, where Germany, Italy, France, Spain and other states would subsequently emerge. The Second Rome, also known as Jerusalem, the Holy City, was at that time the universally recognized religious center of the kingdom. All themes were united by a common Christian religion. Independent local history in Themes at that time was not generally recorded. Chronicles were kept only in Tsargrad, as in the capital of the Christian kingdom, and mainly reflected events that were of interest only to the capital itself. In the 12th century, important events took place in this new Rome, which were later described in the Gospels. The coming of Jesus Christ, his life on the earth, crucifixion and resurrection. The crucifixion of Christ took place in 1185, on Mount Beykoz, which is located on the outskirts of modern Istanbul. In the era of Christ, that is, in the 12th century, Russia immediately and in full adopted Christianity, and not 1,000 years later, as the Scaligerian history assures us. The Russian Tsar Vladimir, that is, the ruler of the world, his mother, Queen Malka, and his chief military commander or ataman came to worship Christ. In the Gospels they are described as three magi, and are commonly known as Balthazar, Melchior and Caspar. In their honor, a huge Cologne cathedral was erected, in which the famous tomb of the three magi was placed. Thus, the events described in the Gospels took place not far from Constantinople in the city of Oros, on the eastern shore of the Bosporus. The city in modern Palestine, today called Jerusalem, was actually manufactured in a rather deserted area of the Middle East from a small Arab settlement of Al-Quds no earlier than the 18th century, or even the 19th, and declared a center of worship. but it has nothing to do with gospel events. The execution of Christ in 1185 in Euros provoked a riotous reaction both in the capital itself and in the themes of the Roman Empire, especially in Russia, which was the birthplace of the Virgin Mary. At the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th centuries, it was Russia that led the Crusades, which moved to Tsargrad in order to avenge the execution of Christ and punish the guilty. In 1204, during the Crusade, Tsargrad was taken. The city was plundered and burned by the Crusaders, that is, the Horde Cossacks and their allies, aka the ancient Greek Achaeans, described by Homer in the Iliad. The Achaeans were led by the so-called ancient Achilles, who is also the Russian Horde Prince Sviatoslav. This event went down in history as the legendary Trojan War, reflected in many documents also under the name of the Tarquinian War, aka Etruscan War, and the Gothic War. In the Scaligerian history of the Middle Ages, this same war is well known under the blanket name of the Crusades of the 13th century. The capture of Constantinople in 1204, then the fall of Constantinople in 1261. In fact, the Trojan War was a series of separate bloody wars.
Modern history attaches great importance to the Crusades. In our reconstruction, they play even more important role. The Great Trojan War of the 13th century AD was the First World War of the Middle Ages. It was a war between East and West. It predetermined the course of world history for several centuries to come.
With the fall of Tsargrad Jerusalem at the beginning of the 13th century AD, a violent civil unrest comes to the Roman kingdom. This begins the escape, flight and at the same time the invasion of various eastern groups from the metropolitan area of the crumbling Rome. They settled in different countries of Europe and Asia. Members of the royal Roman dynasty also fled from the capital to the provinces of the former empire. Some of them did not want to put up with the loss of supreme power and began fighting for world domination.
According to the views of the Roman kings, which had a pronounced religious basis, their royal family had the complete right to own the entire world.
And not only the already known lands, but also all those that will be discovered in the future. They considered this right as a sacred and ancient power belonging to them by inheritance, which, due to temporary reasons, turned out to be illegally taken from them and which had to be returned. As a result, a few states were born that considered themselves successors of ancient Rome. For example, the Nicene Empire. In ancient times, the modern Turkish city of Iznik was the capital of this empire. One of these states was Vladimir Suzdal, Russia, with the capital Rostov the Great. The Vladimir Suzdal Tsars, at that time known as Rostov Tsars, were members of the Roman dynasty, expelled from Tsargrad at the time the Rome fell apart at the beginning of the 13th century. They, like other members of the dynasty, began the struggle to restore the empire. But only they managed to create by both military and peaceful means a powerful multinational state that spanned the Volga and the northern Black Sea regions. By the end of the 13th century, a strong royal power came into being in Russia, based on the vast natural wealth and resources of the country, as well as on its strong and numerous army, the Horde, the backbone of which was cavalry troops, the Cossacks. Thus, in Vladimir Suzdal, Russia, the metropolis of a new empire emerged, the heir to the former Rome. It was Russia Horde, or the Great Mongol Empire. There was no Mongol Tatar yoke in Russia. There was no successful invasion of foreigners into Russia. What is today declared the Mongol Tatar enslavement of Russia was the unification of Russian principalities and the strengthening of royal power in the country. In 1261, the ruler of Nicaea, allied with the troops of Vladimir Suzdal Russia, took by assault Tsargrad. The Great Mongol invasion of the West began from the east, from Vladimir Suzdal Russia. This invasion predetermined the outcome of the Trojan War. The final formation of Vladimir Suzdal Russia took place under the Grand Duke and Grand Khan Georgy Danilovich. Today he is also known to us as Genghis Khan or Gurkin in foreign sources. The armed forces of the state were called the Horde, which in the Old Russian language meant a large military formation, army. The armed forces as a whole were also called the Horde. Due to the fact that the state had unlimited supplies of horses from the herds of the steppe belt, it was able to create a huge cavalry army. Since the horses needed pasture, the army was necessarily nomadic. In order to afford a large army, the rest of the country's population was subject to tribute, the decima. At the head of the state was the king, who had unlimited power, the autocrat. The capital region of the state was Vladimir Suzdal Russia. At that time it was called Veliki Novgorod or Novgorod the Great and entered the annals under this famous name. The center of administrative control was the city of Yaroslavl, denominated in the annals as the Yaroslav's court of Veliki Novgorod. Fortified royal headquarters were located at different times in different cities. In Rostov the Great, in Kostroma, in Vladimir, in Suzdal and in some other cities. Today we call the totality of these ancient Russian cities the Golden Ring of Russia.
According to our reconstruction, Tsar Georgy Danilovich of the 14th century, aka Genghis Khan, founded the Great Mongol Empire and died at a young age. He, like other great kings of the Mongol Empire, was buried in the central ancient imperial cemetery of Egypt, known to us today as the cemetery on the Kizek Field. Apparently, a Cossack cemetery, Khans and emperors of the great empire were buried there. Later, under the pen of historians, he multiplied into several different characters. In particular, he was numbered among the saints. We know him today as George the Victorious. In addition, he is also the famous Rurik, the prince, mistakenly attributed by historians to the 9th century AD. He is also Mstislav Vladimirovich the Brave, attributed by historians erroneously to the 11th century AD. He is also George Vsevolodovich, erroneously attributed by historians to the 13th century AD. He is also Genghis Khan, erroneously placed by historians in the 13th century AD. In fact, Georgy Danilovich lived and ruled in the 14th century AD, in 1319 to 1325 AD.
By the end of the first half of the 14th century, during the reign of Ivan Danilovich Kulita, the Russia Horde began the development and colonization of Eurasia and moved its troops to the west. Russian cavalry troops invaded Europe on a wide front. As a result, much of Western Europe was colonized. The result of the conquests of Grand Duke Georgy Danilovich, and then his brother Ivan Danilovich Kulita, in the first half of the 14th century was the emergence of the Greater Mongol Empire with its center in Vladimir Suzdal Russia. The Russian kingdom is a Russian term, and the Mongol Empire is a Western European term for the same state. In Russian sources, the World Empire was simply called All Russia or the Russian Kingdom. In foreign it was called Mongolian, that is, the Great Empire. In the 14th century, Ivan Kulita, who ruled the empire from 1328 to 1340, founded in Italy both Rome and the Vatican as the center of secular and religious power in Western Europe, as well as the Institute of Popes. Ivan Kulita was both king and high priest, caliph. In the West, he left behind a lot of memories, over time, overgrown with legends and myths. For example, about the medieval king-priest presbyter John. Due to the mistakes of the chroniclers, on the pages of world history he was described several times under different names, including under the name of Batu Khan. Thus, the first half of the 14th century marks the commencement of the conquest of the world by the Russia horde.
During the 14th–16th centuries AD, the Great Mongol Empire extended its influence over the vast territories of Eurasia and America. Moreover, this was not a military operation, not a conquest, but a more or less peaceful colonization of large spaces. Small tribes, nationalities living in these territories could not seriously resist the Cossack imperial troops. Large new states and kingdoms arose on the colonized lands. For example, the Mughal Empire in India, the Mongol Empire in the territory of modern China, the Mamluk Kingdom in Egypt, the Samurai Kingdom in Japan, that is, apparently, immigrants, native of Samara, from the metropolis of Russia horde, and finally, the famous Mayan and Inca kingdoms in America.
This conquest was the first wave. It must be said that at that time it was rather not so much about the military conquest of distant lands, inhabited mainly by wild tribes or generally uninhabited, but about their development and assimilation into the empire. According to some ancient sources, for example, John Malalas or Mavro Orbini, most of the regions of Eurasia and Africa at that time were still sparsely populated. Therefore, the troops of the Russia horde, irresistibly spreading in all directions from the Volga, settled on as yet undeveloped lands and founded new cities, settlements, and cultures. For example, the horde reclamation of India of that era is known to us from ancient sources as the appearance of the famous Aryans there and the foundation of the Aryan Indian civilization in Hindustan. And the Cossacks who came to Egypt founded the Mamluk dynasty there. Then they were described in the history of the so-called ancient Egypt under the name of ancient Hyksos. Numerous ancient chronicles tell about this resettlement from the center of the Horde Empire as dispersal of peoples, as the migration period, as the Great Slavic Conquest, as rise of the Babylon. At the end of the 14th century, the Russia horde comes to a turbulent time. In 1380, a bloody battle took place between the troops of Dmitry Donskoy and the troops of the Temnik, a military leader, Velyaminov Mamai. The capital city and the royal headquarters of Dmitry Donskoy at that time was Kostroma, and the Battle of Kulikovo itself took place on the site of modern Moscow, where the river Yaouza flows into the Moskva River. At that time, the city of Moscow was not there yet. This battle was to decide the final acceptance of apostolic Christianity as the official religion of the entire Mongol Empire. Subsequently, Dmitry Donskoy founded the city of Moscow on the site of the Battle of Kulikovo. After about 100 years of the existence of the Russian Horde Empire, its rulers faced new, previously unseen problems. As a result of state building, a network of good roads was built over vast territories. Epidemics began to spread easily along the well-established caravan routes throughout Eurasia, which from time to time broke out in the south of the empire. The deadly diseases of plague, cholera and others became the inevitable price to pay for uniting vast territories of Europe, Asia and Africa under one rule.
A way out was found by introducing administrative borders on the territory of the vast empire. The first center is Yaroslavl, aka Veliki Novgorod on the Volga, became the center of the Russia horde. The second center, Istanbul on the Bosporus, Constantinople, became the capital of a part of the empire, the Great Ottoman Empire, Atamania. At the same time, Tsargrad regained its former importance, which it had in the 12th–13th centuries AD. In the interim, the authorities of the empire decided on forced quarantine cleaning of the areas where the epidemic broke out. According to the central government, such areas were the lands of Western and Southern Europe. Ottoman Cossack troops were sent there with a cruel order to murder the sick population of those territories, and to repopulate all those lands. This huge operation is known today as the Ottoman or Ataman conquest. It is also described in the Bible as the conquest of the Promised Land in the books, Exodus and Joshua.
Such was the situation in the many lands of Western and Southern Europe. The troops of the horde, the Cossacks, were sent to these areas with strict orders to slay the population of vast territories and repopulate them. This is the famous history of the Ottoman conquest of the 15th century. Thus, in the 15th century, the Russia horde was forced to send troops to the south and west for the second time. This was the second wave of conquests, that is, the conquests of previously subjugated territories, on which, starting from the 14th century, there were already armed forces of local rulers, governors of the horde, who did not want to be slain. However, the quarantine purge was carried out by force and very consistently. New governors were planted on the reconquered lands of Europe and Asia. In Russian history, these events are known as a large-scale allocation of the Novgorod lands to the boyars, the children of the boyars, the nobles, and even the best serfs.
As a result, in the middle of the 15th century, on the site of the ancient Roman Empire, the Ottoman or Ataman Empire arose with its center in Istanbul, which was an ally of the Russia horde. By the way, the very name of the Atamans, the generic name of the sultans, comes from the well-known name Hetman Ataman, which was the name of the progenitor of the Ataman sultans. At the same time, Western Europe and all of Eurasia are still under the rule of the Great Mongol Empire. Europe, apparently, is somehow divided between the Russia horde and Osmania-Atamania. Meanwhile, Europe and other territories of Eurasia pay tribute to the central government. Historians call these payments tribute to the Sultan.
At that time, each country in Western Europe had its horde governor king. The governors were subordinate to the central ruler of the Great Mongol Empire, that is, the emperor. Western Europeans referred to the great Tsar Khan of the Russia horde as emperor, who ruled in Veliki Novgorod, far from them. There was only one empire, and naturally there was one emperor. In the 15th–16th centuries, a religious split of the previously unified Christianity into several large branches of religions was outlined in the empire.
Namely, Orthodoxy, Islam, Catholicism, Buddhism and Judaism.
These names they will acquire only in the 17th–18th centuries. Thus, all the main religions known today came from one root, from a united Christianity of the 12th–13th centuries. This explains in particular the conclusions drawn by the large school of 19th-century scholars working in the field of so-called comparative religion. After processing a huge amount of material, they found amazingly much in common between all these religions. But being bound hand and foot by the incorrect Scaligerian chronology, they decided that Christianity absorbed numerous elements of supposedly earlier cults.
Actually, it is not correct.
On the contrary, in the 16th and 17th centuries, previously united Christianity was divided into several religions, each of which naturally inherited a significant part of the former cult, modifying it. At the same time, they divided previously uniform symbolism. The wide cross was primarily used by the Orthodox Church, the narrow cross by the Catholic Church, the six-pointed star, one of the forms of the cross, by Judaism, and the crescent with a star, also one of the forms of the cross, by Islam.
Most likely, the Gospels were written at the end of the 12th century AD or early 13th century. The remaining books of the Old Testament were written in a later period. The edition of the Gospel which has come down to us, and the one we know today, apparently belongs to the 14th–15th centuries AD, and the books of the Old Testament were finished being written and edited only in the middle of the 17th century AD, that is, very late.
In the 16th century, the empire reached the highest point of its power and prosperity.
Moscow took over from Yaroslavl Veliki Novgorod on the Volga the functions of the capital city.
Instead of a small settlement on the territory of modern Moscow, a grand construction began, on which the best architects from various provinces were brought to work. First, an underground city was built using cut-and-cover method. Then it was covered with ceilings and an elevated city of Moscow was erected. This gigantic construction made a deep impression on contemporaries and was described on the pages of many so-called ancient sources of the 16th–17th centuries. Herodotus described 16th-century Moscow as an Egyptian labyrinth. The Bible calls it the rebuilding of Jerusalem. In the middle of the 16th century, the Kazan kingdom, also known as the famous Khanate of Kazan, became the center of the Jewish religion. The Kazan Tsar, that is, the Khazar Kagan and his court, adopted Judaism. After that, Kazan made an attempt to separate from the empire. In 1552, Tsar Khan Ivan the Terrible brutally suppressed the Kazan rebellion. One should not think that medieval Kazan or Khazar Judaism and contemporary Judaism are the same thing. Many modern concepts had a completely different meaning in the Middle Ages. Jew meant glorifying God. And in the 15th–16th centuries, Osmania Adamania with its capital in the Gospel Jerusalem Istanbul was called Judea. In the era of religious disagreements, any part of the province of the empire could call itself Israel to emphasize its rectitude in a religious dispute. Above all, the word Israel, that is, a crusader for God, was a religiously colored name in the Russian Empire of the Middle Ages. In the second half of the 16th century, a revolt of the Horde governors broke out in Western Europe, who no longer wanted to obey the distant Tsar Khan of Veliki Novgorod and wanted to become independent rulers. As an ideological basis for the uprising, the banner of religious separation from the empire was chosen.
Lutheranism, which emerged in the West, was used by the rebel reformers as a pretext for political separation from the empire.
Having suppressed the rebellion in Kazan, the Russia Horde turned its gaze to the seething West. It was decided to send punitive troops there. In Russian sources, these events are known as the beginning of the Livonian War.
We emphasize that the whole of Western Europe is actually called Lithuania in that context. Historians then covertly portrayed the matter as if it was only a small modern Lithuania in the Baltics. In fact, the great empire in the 16th century sought to bring all of Western Europe to obedience. And only later did historians begin to depict things as if the punitive campaign was directed not against all of Western Europe, but only against a small modern Lithuania in the Baltics.
Preparations began for a major punitive campaign in Western Europe. But at that moment, turmoil began in the capital of the empire, which turned into terror and the Oprichnina.
According to our research, in Russian history 4 czars who ruled one after another in fact went by the same name of Ivan the Terrible. Later, Romanov historians slyly combined them under one name and called them by the shared name Ivan the Terrible.
The first czar is Ivan Vasilievich. In his reign, Kazan was taken. But later Tsar Ivan IV fell ill, became the Blessed and retired. Today he is known to us under the name of Saint Basil the Blessed. In his honor, the majestic Pokrovsky Cathedral was built on Moscow's Red Square, which is popularly called Saint Basil's Cathedral. Then the young son of Ivan the Terrible, Dmitry, became king. On his behalf, the chosen council, the board of trustees headed by Adashev, ruled for 10 years. It was at this time the Livonian War began in order to bring Germany, which was engulfed in the rebellion of the Reformation, to obedience. After the tragic death of the teenage Tsar Dmitry, his younger brother Ivan ascended the throne. From Ivan's accession to the throne, his relatives on the maternal side, the pro-Western Zakharians Romanovs, actually ruled the state. It was they who raised Ivan. As a result, a group of Lutherans, whom the Russian Orthodox Church called Judaizers, came to power for some time. They disrupted the Livonian War, that is, the punitive Russian horde campaign to the west that had already begun. In Russian history, the era of the Oprichnina began. The largest massacre of the horde nobility occurred, including the heirs of the Russian horde throne, as well as the sack and destruction of the old Russian capital, Yaroslavl. The famous Oprichnina ended with the defeat of Moscow in 1572. By that time, even the Oprichnina itself was being destroyed. Essentially, it was the defeat of the Zakharians clan. After this, Simeon Bekbalatovich, the leader of the Zemshchina and a member of the ruling house, came to power. He took the royal name Ivan and tried to continue the Livonian War. But Russia's forces were exhausted by the time of troubles and terror.
According to the authors of the New Chronology, later these 4 czars were merged into one image, the image of Tsar Ivan Vasilievich the Terrible.
So, at the end of the 16th century, the Oprichnina was defeated and the rule of the old Horde dynasty was restored. This was a new dynastic branch. Simeon Ivan, then his son Fyodor Ivanovich, and then Boris Godunov. However, it was already too late. The Protestants had taken strong positions at the court of the Russia horde. Shortly thereafter, a new major time of troubles occurred at the beginning of the 17th century. The royal power passed to the Romanovs. As a result of the openly pro-Western policy of the Romanovs and the military-political weakening of Russia itself, the empire fell apart into several states: Russia, Turkey, Austria, Germany, Poland, Sweden, France, Spain, Egypt, England, China, India, America, Japan, and some other states of Europe and Asia. In Western Europe, former Mongol governors who had split from the metropolis entered into a fierce struggle for land and influence. Heavy wars broke out, now known as the Wars of the Reformation.
The fierce division of the inheritance of the great empire lasted for many decades.
In order to justify their rights to the power they seized and distributed among themselves, the usurpers, rebels in Western Europe and the Romanovs in Russia were forced to rewrite the history of the past. The Great Mongol Empire was erased from the chronicles. Many important events were deliberately pushed into the distant past. The fraudulent Scaligerian chronology was created for this purpose, intentionally aging the dates of many events from the 14th–16th centuries. By creating a false, convenient version of history, the new authorities sought to prove their supposed antiquity and therefore establish their non-existent hereditary rights to the throne. In the provinces that became independent, based on the former state church Slavonic language of the empire and local dialects, reformers quickly invented and actively introduced new languages. This gave rise, for example, to French, German, Spanish, English, as well as Ancient Latin and Ancient Greek. This allowed the reformist rebels to erect language barriers between the populations of the newly formed states. The goal was clear: to destroy the former unity of the empire. But even after the collapse of the empire, there was still a danger for Western Europe that the crisis in Russia would be overcome. The success of the Reformation rebellion was still not secured and, in general, largely depended on the whim of the Moscow Tsar Romanov, even though he was an ally of Western Europe. Today he is a political appointee and ally, but tomorrow he may change his mind. In addition, there was Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, which was not defeated at all. The center of the rebellion, Western Europe, tried to not allow the revival of the Great Mongol Empire. Probably unable to achieve this by military means, Western European politicians made the main emphasis on diplomatic work. The goal of Europe was to split the former alliance of Russia Horde and Turkey Ottomania. This task was successfully implemented. The Romanovs initiated a policy of political alienation of Russia from Turkey. It was at this time that the Russo-Turkish Wars began. Now Russia and Turkey had no time for Western Europe. They were sorting out their own relationship. For a while, Western Europe got a respite. The penultimate attempt of the Horde to regain power was the so-called uprising of Stepan Razin, which was actually not a rebellion, but a war between two states, fragments of the former empire. Namely, the Moscow states, where the rebellious boyars Romanovs were already in power, and the southern Russian Astrakhan state, where descendants of the old Russian Horde dynasty remained in power. Stepan Timofeyevich Razin was a commander of the Astrakhan Tatar troops. In this war, the Romanovs relied heavily on military support from Western Europe. Their most reliable troops, Reiter regiments, were composed of foreign Western European mercenaries. The war ended with the defeat of the Horde troops and the annexation of the territory of the Astrakhan state to Moscow. However, there still remained a huge Russian Horde state, covering Siberia, the Far East, and a significant part of the North American continent. This state was called Great Tartary. In the 17th and 18th centuries, all centers of resistance of the old Mongolian dynasties were suppressed. For example, the Horde civilizations in the territory of America were drowned in blood by the troops of Western European reformers who invaded them in the 17th and 18th centuries. Later, Western historians shifted all the atrocities of this operation approximately 200 years down in time, to the 15th century, and retroactively attributed them to the period of the Horde Ottoman colonization of America, deceptively calling the previous and quite peaceful Horde colonization of the 15th century the bloody Spanish conquest. Thus, they slyly repainted white as black on paper and vice versa, shifting their atrocities onto others. At the end of the 18th century, there was a well-known war between the Romanovs and Pugachev. The events of 1773 to 1775 were not just the suppression of a peasant Cossack uprising, as we are explained today. It was a real large-scale war between the Romanovs and the last independent Russo horde state, the Great Tartary, with its capital in the Siberian city of Tobolsk. Only by winning the war with Pugachev did the Romanovs gain access to Siberia for the first time. And it was only after this that the Americans gained access to the western half of the North American continent and began to quickly capture it. But the Romanovs were not idle either. At first, they managed to grab Alaska, but ultimately could not hold on to it. As a result of the victory over Great Tartary, the United States of America emerged from the ruins of the Horde Empire in America. The final division of the empire took place in the 19th century. This feast of the victors was completely erased from history textbooks. Even in the 18th century, the rule of the Romanovs largely remained an occupation of Russia by foreigners. The serfdom as we know it was introduced by the first Romanovs and was nothing but the enslavement of the native-born populace in the conquered lands of the former metropolis by foreigners. Centuries-old traditions and customs of the Russian people were broken. An attempt was made to carry out a profound church reform, which fortunately did not succeed and led only to a schism, but not to the division of the Russian Orthodox Church. Only many years later, closer to the end of their reign, did the Romanovs change, as if mutated under the influence of many factors of Russian life and turned into Russians in spirit as rulers. Russia, occupied by Western Europeans in the 17th century, largely assimilated the initial Western European regime of the Romanovs. After the war with Pugachev, having strengthened their throne and being at the head of a huge country, the Romanovs felt like true masters of a large and rich state. They emerged from subordination, lost their reverence for their former Western masters and decided to revive the Russian Empire in the broadest sense of the word. It's hard for someone who hears about the new chronology of Fomenko and Nozovsky for the first time.
Understanding history is quite challenging, not to mention the vast amount of information that needs to be learned.
However, having a correct understanding of the past is so important that it justifies any time spent acquiring new knowledge. Much of what is happening today becomes understandable only after we learn the real history of the world.
Of course, we understand that it may be difficult for a newcomer who wants to delve deeper into all of this. Some may even experience shock when introduced to our version, as it differs so much from the history that is widely accepted today. Nevertheless, we are convinced that those who want to make sense, get acquainted with the facts, and carefully look into the logic of the research will soon accept our point of view.
A revolution has been brewing in history, similar to the revolutions that have occurred in natural sciences. Humanity cannot afford to keep treading water indefinitely, especially when there are real prerequisites for revising established dogmas. Changes in our understanding of the past are inevitable and necessary. After all, the correct chronology of history affects so much, and it lies unconsciously at the foundation of much knowledge, including climatology and earthquake predictions, understanding the evolution of populations and sociology, linguistics and cultural studies, psychology, and many others. The new chronology eliminates a large number of mysteries and puzzles, providing simple and natural explanations for them. The chronology and history up to the 18th century AD form the foundation of many political concepts and beliefs of our time. For example, all territorial disputes are actually based on who lived on a particular land first. The roots of these conflicts and disputes go back to chronology. In the event of a change in chronology, territorial claims would also change.
Modern religions have a common source, and understanding this should serve to eliminate painful contradictions that have arisen since the Reformation.
When the empire was divided into provinces, various branches of Christianity emerged. Certain differences in Christian beliefs existed even before the empire's split, but they were not so acute that the unified religion would break up into several faiths so different from each other. Today, humanity could return to these religious origins to eliminate religious strives. The implementation of the existing version of history has led to the estrangement and scattering of peoples who now think of themselves as separate and independent fragments of humanity. After all, it is obvious that correct history influences the formation of a correct worldview. Otherwise, a distorted picture of the world is obtained. But above all, history itself must become a science, and it is already becoming one. How is the false Scaligerian version of history introduced into people's consciousness? How is it possible to do this simultaneously in all countries? We will talk in detail about the falsification of world history and how this became possible in our next film, Falsification of History.